Revealed, I interview him 40 times. He said to me one day, you've got a background in logic. You've got to start to let people know about this, because since the educational system is being destroyed, people are coming out of it completely unable to really think. They're going for slogans, catchphrases, stereotypes, archetypes. They're ripe for every kind of propaganda under the sun. I thought about that, and I realized he was right. And some years later, I put together this course, which was really directed originally at homeschoolers, but I also wanted to market it to private schools, and I did eventually market it to a private school in the San Diego area, but sold it to a lot of homeschoolers, and then I decided to include it in the Matrix Revealed. Logic is a way, first of all, for whether it's children or adults, of being able to read material or listen to material and trace the actual argument. Where does it begin? Where does it go? What does it conclude? And I use argument in the logical sense of somebody's trying to prove a point, somebody's trying to get somewhere. How do you follow that? How do you know where it begins and where it meanders and how it gets to its conclusion and how reliable or valid it is? And how can that be applied to the flood of information with which we're overwhelmed every day now? So I didn't want to make it too remote and abstract and formal, although some of that is necessary. But eventually, which I did, I wanted to link it up to actual text passages that people might encounter every day, embed them with logical flaws and fallacies so that they would begin to chew on these and work them over and see where things go wrong, logically speaking, to make, in other words, real detectives out of people in the logical sense, so that they feel that they finally have a really firm foundation in being able to reason and follow other people's reasoning to see whether it is indeed valid or not. And it was met with a lot of enthusiasm. I mean, I got more response to that than probably anything that I've ever put on my website when I began writing articles about logic and the logic course. And one of the things I discovered was that in some cases, what was being diagnosed as ADHD was really a lack of logic. Because if you don't have logic and you begin to try to tackle words and texts and information, there's a tendency to wander and to get distracted and have shorter attention span because you don't really see the thread. You don't really see where it's going. You don't really follow the reasoning process. But when you can do that, attention spans get longer, interest level gets higher, the person feels empowered to be a real investigative detective, and suddenly everything changes. And I found this with children. I found this with adults. It was absolutely remarkable, the latent abilities that would come out in people. And when I came on the air, you were reading a passage from one of my recent articles, Post-Apocalyptic Education, about a group of kids that I saw that had in fact been trained in logic well, who went after the transcript of a murder trial, and they were phenomenal. I mean, these were kids, some of whom were seemingly barely literate, but all of a sudden, something, that you would almost call it magical occurred, because once they had these principles in tow, they could look at extremely complex clusters of data, and they could begin to analyze it and rip it apart and tear it to shreds. And they went over that murder trial, and they found so many flaws in the arguments from both the defense and the prosecution and some of the rulings that were made from the bench. It was a revelation to them, to me, we were just staggered by the end of it. And they felt, and rightly so empowered, that I was inspired. I said, I've got to write a course on this, and it's got to be a real course, not a seminar, not a little workshop, but an 18-lesson course with a teacher's manual, lesson plans, a final exam. Let's really get down and dig into this just the way I was dug into this by this fantastic professor that I had at college who put us through the mill. But when we came out the other side, we were ready to take on anything, literally anything. And that's
well, that sounds like a challenge. Perhaps we should put that to the test. Why don't we do a little bit of a practical demonstration for the listeners out there who I'm sure encounter all sorts of fallacious arguments in their daily lives and may not know how to break them down, how to understand them, how to parse what's really happening. So perhaps I can assume the role of skeptic McGrouchy Pants, and you can be the logical professor who's going to tell us what is being, what fallacious statements are being put forward in my argumentation.
It sounds very interesting.
If you're game.
Sure. So, let's have a go.
Okay, so for example, skeptic McGrouchy Pants says that all conspiracy theorists have the need to believe that there is some sort of overarching explanation for things, and that's why they want to see, for example, that 9/11 was an inside job.
Ad hominem argument, cleverly concealed. Ad hominem means, and that's one of the logical fallacies, it used to be taught in the public schools maybe 100 years ago, a list of about 10 to 15 logical fallacies that once you learned them, you could inspect any information and you would be able to find them. Ad hominem means to the man, literally in Latin, in which you attack the person rather than take up the actual content of the argument. And in this case, McGrouchy is what he's doing here is using a kind of psychological version of ad hominem by saying we have to really look at the motivation behind why these people are saying that 9/11 is a conspiracy. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, in a courtroom, for example, does the defense attorney say, look, the only reason the prosecutor is really here is because he wants to add another notch on his belt? I mean, the judge would rule that out of bounds, and if the defense attorney kept it up, he would be put in jail on contempt charges. Because logical people recognize that's not really part of the argument. The question is, in case of 9/11, what is the argument that a person is making for a conspiracy? We have to look at the content of it and examine it carefully. We don't care what the motivation is. In fact, we know right away that the person who's making the 9/11 argument is being attacked on the basis of motivation as a way of deflecting him and saying that he is somehow psychologically challenged, he has a need that has to be met. In fact, I would go so far as to say that a considerable portion of modern psychology is in fact ad hominem argument against the patient. See, because the patient comes in and says, I have problems. I don't know what to do with my life. The psychologist says, yes, but you see, there are reasons why you're doing what you're doing, and this is what we have to uncover. And right away, if the patient buys into that, suddenly the patient is, in a sense, on the defensive. Because now it's not a question of whether or not the patient is intelligent, has some really pertinent criticisms of society, for example, the way society is structured. All of this is now suddenly irrelevant because the psychologist is saying, yeah, but I don't really care why you're making these arguments. What the content is of the arguments. We have to get down to the roots of your psychological problems, and then we can solve all this. And then the implication, just as in McGrouchy's argument, is if the 9/11 conspiratorial researcher understood the roots of why he has to make this argument in the first place, he would be, quote, cured of the need to do so. Then there would be no argument, and there would be no content, and there would be nothing to examine. So that's really...
But, John, everyone knows that if there was some big conspiracy behind something like 9/11, someone would have blown the whistle.
argument number 2.
Argument number 2.
This is an attempt to, again, it's a bit of ad hominem, attacking the person making the argument, but it's also attempting to float a generality, okay? That's another logical fallacy. Empty generality. One of the more frequent forms of illogic that you'll find everywhere. The idea is you make a generalization, but the generalization is vague, it's empty, it doesn't seem to be subject to verification. How are we going to decide whether it's really true or not? But it becomes the premise by which McGrouchy can try to deflect again the conspiratorial researcher. And here's the generality. It's the word conspiracy. Everybody knows that a conspiracy, in order to succeed, would have to be shared by hundreds, if not thousands of people if you're talking something on the level of 9/11, and therefore this is not a conspiracy because certainly some of those people would have already talked about their role in the conspiracy and they didn't, therefore no conspiracy. That's basically the logical argument. So what I would do in that case is to say to McGrouchy, define conspiracy. What is it that you actually mean when you use this general term? And I would keep on badgering and pestering McGrouchy until he actually defined what a conspiracy was, at which point we would now have something to actually discuss. And I would be able to give examples, for instance, of how a compartmentalized conspiracy could operate, where several people at the top would know the true agenda and everyone else would be operating under orders in a compartmentalized fashion in order to carry out their missions and therefore make the conspiracy succeed. And a perfect example of that would be something that used to be called the USSR. It was operated supposedly under Marxian philosophy, which indicated that you would have a dictatorship of the proletariat. And during that time, there would be a caring and sharing and humanitarian attempt to bring everyone in sharing the wealth of the society, at which point eventually it would all wither away naturally and you would have paradise on earth. That was the whole argument. And I would say, okay, let us now examine the actual bureaucratic structure of the USSR and let's see how that worked out. How many people could we point to at the top of the structure that actually had hugely more benefits than the proletariat? And when we examine this and do research on it, do we actually find that it was only 3 or 4 people who were laboring, under living the high life because they wanted to serve everybody else? Or was this really a sham and a con from the beginning? A heist, a complete heist. And if so, how did this conspiracy succeed? And I could then begin to argue that it was through compartmentalization of tasks in an overall structure, hierarchical structure, so that different people had different jobs, and when they all did their jobs and didn't question anything, it all added up to the USSR as it once existed. That was a conspiracy against the people of Russia. It can work that way. I could give numerous other examples of how a conspiracy, in fact, can take place without most of the people knowing the true agenda at the top, and therefore the argument that all conspiracies have to be shared intimately by thousands of people would be shown to be invalid. But none of that would happen if I were to allow the empty generality of the word conspiracy to go by the boards and didn't pin down McGrouchy on being able to define that accurately. And that's where I would attack first. And that's
well,
what
I think,
have.
you'd be exactly right to do so, because as you pointed out earlier, no one accuses a prosecutor in a criminal court case of being a conspiracy